I've often found it ironic that the modern enlightened mind often reels at the idea of mystical or Gnostic insight, or, well, enlightenment. So much so that when I give public talks on medieval mystics, the angelic conversations of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly, or the widespread belief and even systematization of magic in the pre-modern period, there's almost always someone in the crowd that asks, well, what kind of drugs were they on? And this is often followed by a healthy dose of laughter from the crowd. My first impulse, and I think the impulse of many scholars, is to point out the actual fact of the matter. In the Western European context, and I can't speak otherwise, there's actually very little evidence for the use of psychoactive substances at work in pre-modern mysticism and magic. That's not to say it didn't happen, there's just very little evidence for it. Even claims that ergotism, a disease brought on by a fungus that grows on rye and a precursor to LSD, as an explanation for the so-called witch craze, has long been debunked. Of course, part of what motivates this is an urge on my part, and I think on the part of many scholars, to put magic and mysticism on a more firm academic footing, given how maligned it's been in recent history. I think that scholars fear that evidence for the use of psychoactive substances in magic and mysticism would only serve to further discredit our legitimate scholarship. So are we telling the whole truth? Well, yes and no. Is there evidence for psychoactive substance use by the overwhelming majority of mystics or magical texts? No, the honest answer is there isn't much evidence. But what does the evidence actually look like? Could mystics or magic practitioners have had access to such substances? The answer here seems to be murky, and I want to explore a possible line of access. In 1558, Giambattista della Porta published his enormously popular Magiae Naturalis, or Natural Magic. And in that text, there's a very interesting collection of recipes for a series of potions. So let's explore this magical textbook, where we find a series of potions which, quote, make a person out of their mind for a day and provide for, quote, visions both wonderful and horrible. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. There can be no doubt that psychoactive substances have played an enormous part in religious life through the millennia. From shamanic use to the cannabinoids recently found in the earliest shrine of the Israelite god, alcohol for the mysteries of Bacchus and Christ, the use of nicotine and peyote among indigenous people of the Americas, caffeine keeping the Kabbalists of Sfat up on all-night vigils, the use of ayahuasca by New Age pilgrims in the Church of Santo Daime, the list could go on and on. Indeed, researchers at Johns Hopkins are just now beginning scientific studies of the intersection of these substances and spirituality, and recent books, such as Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, are slowly beginning to change public perception of these powerful substances. If anything, European religious history, both exoteric and esoteric, is conspicuous in its lack of such substances in its literature. Perhaps it appears on the margins, but outside of alcohol consumption, very few other references to other forms of intoxication appear in the literature. But did it happen? I'm rather certain that it did, but the evidence remains scant. I want to turn to what may be an exception. Following a discussion of sleep-inducing substances, there follows in the second chapter of the 8th book of Giambattista della Porta's 1558 on natural magic, a chapter which provides a series of compounds which, quote, make a person out of their mind for a day, as opposed to those which, quote, perpetuate madness forever, and allow further one to use this state of being, quote, mente alienatos, for, quote, fun for a day and afterwards leaves no harm. What we have here are potions that seem to provide for a kind of recreational madness. So, first and foremost, I'm only going to provide these recipes on the screen in Latin, with key sections blurred out, and I'm going to be pretty selective in my translations. The reason for this should be obvious. Please, do not attempt to take any recipes, much less those for inducing such a state, from medieval books and attempt to make them, much less ingest them. These compounds contain powerful herbs which I suspect can cause a range of deleterious effects, including psychosis and perhaps even death. Further, medieval measurements are anything other than precise, and there is simply no recreating these recipes with any degree of accuracy. Really, seriously, do not attempt to recreate any recipes you find in medieval books. That said, what follows in Della Porta's account are a series of 4 quote-unquote potions, to use the language of the text, which cause a range of effects. The first induces a person to sleep. They will then awake to some confusion, and they will, quote, rave or be silly. The Latin here could be translated in both ways. And then, after falling asleep again, they will return to normal. According to Della Porta, this is all voluptuosum videre, or delightful to behold. It should also be noted that if you read the text carefully, it seems like this potion is actually meant to be a sort of prank. Della Porta seemed to indicate that he gave this to someone without their consent, which just seems frightfully unethical. A second potion also induces, quote, post aliquas horas dementat ut mirabilis visionis potori ostendat jucundus horribiliis varias, or, quote, after a few hours makes one mad and produces wonderful visions both delightful and horrible. This one can be apparently turned into a powder and causes, quote, pleasant madness for a day. Similarly, a third potion, quote, quod homines dementat inaxi speculum videre tam delirius ineptas et visiones. That is to say, it makes men mad without any harm, such that it is a spectacle to behold such delightful whimsies and visions. Della Porta concludes this potion by telling us that he knew of a, quote, friend who could do this as much as he pleased. Sure, Della Porta, a friend. Right. Finally, there's a potion which, quote, persuades men that they have become beasts or birds, or provides for, quote, insanias ad libitum, or madness at your pleasure. This potion apparently made Della Porta's friends believe that they were a goose, a bird, and a fish, and even made them adopt the diets of those animals. Again, this seems to be a case where Della Porta has given this compound to his roommates without their consent. And this, friends, is why we have ethics panels. Another one of Della Porta's roommates seems to have thrown himself onto the floor and begun to attempt to swim, and as the potion wore off, he acted like a, quote, man shipwrecked. He began to remove his clothes and breathe heavily. One might conclude that despite the fact that Della Porta always tells us that this is, quote, pleasant madness for a day, that this person seemed to have actually had what we would now call a bad trip. One point we might take from all this is don't be friends with people like Giambattista della Porta. At any rate, he concludes this section with an admonition that, quote, these and many other most delightful things the curious searcher may find. It is enough that I, Della Porta, have hinted at the manner of how to do these things. So what can we conclude from these passages on natural magic, which may just be some of the earliest European references to the recreational use of psychoactive substances? Despite the fact that they appear in a text called On Natural Magic, there is no evidence of them being used for mystical, magical, or religious ends. Recall the distinction between natural and ritual magic at this time. Ritual magic would have been used to, for instance, conjure a spirit to do your bidding, while natural magic is an understanding of the occult, though natural relationship between astral forces, minerals, herbs, and their sympathetic relations and causal relationships. Those who engaged in natural magic often sought to distinguish themselves very seriously from those who engaged in ritual magic, which was often illicit. So what we have in Della Porta's text is somewhere between magic and what we would now call science. And this is very evident from the table of contents in Della Porta's text. What is missing from this text is something like a unifying concept, like what would eventually become the scientific method. The further question is there any evidence of Della Porta's potions or something like them being used for religious, mystical, or magical ends? With the exception of flying ointments, which use many of the same herbal compounds found in Della Porta's text. We'll discuss historical flying potions in another episode. I think the jury's out, and I think this will be a fantastic line of research. Do we have accounts of anyone using these potions outside of Della Porta's text? It seems difficult to believe that these potions were unknown outside of Della Porta and his friends that he, well, liked to experiment upon. So the question that interests me is, could these potions, or similar kinds of potions, have been used for religious, magical, or mystical ends? Sure, but more research needs to be done. Certainly we know that Della Porta's On Natural Magic was enormously popular. And further, we know that people like Dr. John Dee owned a copy. So this naturally raises the question when we think about the spirit diaries of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. Could Della Porta's potions, or something like them, have had a hand in the spirit conversations between Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly? Again, there's no evidence that he did, but this is a fantastic general line of research. What compounds like those described by Della Porta were being used in the European context in the Middle Ages and the early modern period? So, at any rate, what we have here is an early, perhaps one of the earliest descriptions of recreational psychedelic use in Western Europe. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, in a book on natural magic. If you're interested in historical magic, stay tuned here to Esoterica. We often explore historical magical books, their spells, and their influence. Make sure to subscribe and consider supporting Esoterica on Patreon. And remember, if you sign up for Patreon to support Esoterica by the end of July 2020, you enter into a raffle to win this depiction from the Munich Necromancer's Manual of a spell for invisibility, handwritten by me. So if you're interested in winning this piece of calligraphy, make sure to sign up for Patreon by the end of July of 2020. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.